Thank you. Well, it's good to be back to Illinois. It's been a while since I've been here, so thank you for inviting me. And today I'm going to be talking to you about the healthcare crisis, because libertarians, I believe, have the only solution. And in addition to that, we are in crisis, and this is going to be a big topic that we need to be very conversant on. So let me get started. First of all, healthcare costs are soaring. We all know that. But they're so large, what you might not know is nobody, not even the federal government, can pay for them. So what we're having now is things aren't getting paid for, and we're having healthcare rationing. For example, if you have or think you may have eligibility for VA benefits because you served your country in one of the military branches, you might find that you're going to be denied care. And turns out you have to show need in order to be able to get VA care today. Also Medicaid, if you have Medicaid, in theory, you are covered and can go to any doctor you want. The problem is Medicaid pays so little that most doctors will only see a few Medicaid patients, and you may have to wait for months before you get in. And Medicare, well, doctors are deciding they're not going to take it because, again, Medicare benefits have been slashed, so doctors aren't getting enough to make it worth their while to take Medicare patients. You can just imagine what's going to happen with the baby boomers retire. I've already received a letter from my doctor saying, if you're going to go on Medicare anywhere in the near future, you should know that I am no longer taking any Medicare patients. And the reason is, if you take one Medicare patient as a doctor, you are subject to a bunch of regulations that you would not otherwise be subject to. And most doctors don't want to have to pay the extra money to have an extra person to meet these regulations. So they're not going to take Medicare patients. Now, even if you have private insurance, you're not safe. And the reason is that even in the private sector, healthcare is being rationed. If you have had a loved one that has been dying recently, you probably know this well. When my sister was sick, 20 years ago even, I had to sleep by her bedside on the floor if I wanted her to get proper care, because the squeaky wheel gets the grease, so to speak, in the hospital setting. It's not that the nurses and the doctors and everyone that works there doesn't want to give everyone excellent care. They are fantastic, but there's only so many of them. And so it's very, very difficult sometimes to get their attention. And I can tell you that because of that, some people die for that lack of attention that they sorely need. So we're already in crisis, but most people don't know it until they have to go in and actually use their medical care. So this is not going to be solved by throwing more money at it. There isn't any more money to throw at it. We've already passed that point. What we have to do is find out why medical care costs are so high. And that's something libertarians have a unique position on, a unique way of bringing the point to the public. Although even libertarians, for the most part, haven't done a very good job of this, because unless you're actually in the healthcare industry, sometimes it's kind of hard to see. So that's what we're going to talk about today, so that you'll be empowered to go out and share the message with those who want to know, with the people that you're going to talk to as candidates, and your friends and family, so that when this does come to crisis, and it will, it's already coming. The House decided to defund Obamacare, so you see it's a hot issue right now. When this happens, you'll be prepared. So, most people think, when they think of high health care costs, one of the first things they think of are lawsuits. These runaway civil actions where a doctor, for example, is charged with malpractice when in fact the infant he delivered was actually deformed and it was no fault of his. But a big settlement comes about because courts tend to give victims money even if the person that's being sued had nothing to do with the problem. And these runaway civil suits do increase the cost of health care, but it's only about 5 to 10%. It's not the big gorilla. And of course, a lot of libertarian foundations are putting out a lot of great information about how the third-party payer system is responsible for a lot of waste. Since the average patient doesn't even know what the full cost of their medical care is, they can hardly go value shopping. All they know is how much their copay is. And when instead they have to pay attention because they pay, they have a higher deductible, say, through their health savings accounts, and so they have to take that money out of their own health savings account to pay, they do watch and do value shopping, and they're more careful about how they spend their medical care dollars, and costs do go down somewhere in the 10 to 20% range. So, you know, that is an important factor, and it's really good that we have libertarian foundations out there that are pointing this out and doing these studies. But we still haven't really gotten to the bottom of it, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Because the big item, the big ticket item in healthcare costs are what I'm going to call excess regulation, which is libertarians, of course, we figure it's all excess, but I'm going to define it as regulations that harm us instead of help us for the purposes of this talk. So regulations that harm us instead of help us account for about 50 to 90% healthcare costs today. 50 to 90%. That's huge, and I'm going to show you some calculations that should make that credible to you. Now, what regulations am I talking about? Well, I'm talking about all of them, but today we'll focus on one that's very easy to look at. So all of them means, for example, all the state regulations for the different occupational licenses, like medical doctors, nurses, physicians assistants, hospital regulations, insurance mandates, but many of these are state regulated. So every state has a different mix. Very, very difficult to get your hands on that and really do a good analysis to see what the costs are. So what we're going to focus on today is the one arena in which healthcare costs are nationally regulated, and that's pharmaceutical regulation. That's under the purview of the FDA. That's something I know a lot about since I was in the pharmaceutical industry for 19 years. So I want to share some information with you. Now, before we get started on that, I want to talk a little bit about where we were in the 1960s, because in 1962 is when the FDA got its teeth, so to speak. Regulations were passed in 1962 that really changed the whole pharmaceutical industry. And I want to share with you where we were at that point so you can see how devastating these regulations were. In the early 1960s, we had finally conquered the #1 killer, which was infection. It wasn't cardiovascular disease or cancer, it was infection. You know, prior to the 1960s, you know, somewhere in the 1930s to 50s, we got antibiotics, we had good sanitation, and infection no longer was the #1 killer. So we were feeling pretty good about medicine and pharmaceuticals at that point in time. The other important thing is we were finally learning about vitamins and nutrients and how important they were to our well-being. Not only that, we had discovered their structures, and in many cases we had the ability to make them, synthesize them. And what's good about that is it made them available year-round. For example, vitamin C. We all know that originally the way vitamin C was as a cure for scurvy. And the beauty of being able to make vitamin C is it could be available in a pill all year round. Now the people who were out at sea for months at a time didn't have to take oranges, limes, lemons. They could take a little pill, which is great, and you could have it all year round. No excuse for scurvy anymore. And this was true of some of the B vitamins as well, and vitamin E. So the pharmaceutical companies were starting to put out one-a-day multiple vitamins. They were very low potency by today's standards, but at least that was the beginning. So we were now in a place where we could think about optimal nutrition. And of course, we had many, many new drugs, and it was very exciting because some of these drugs were very potent and helped people in diseases that they couldn't be helped in before. So it was a very exciting time. We were poised on a golden age of health. But then we passed the 1962 Kefauver-Harris amendments and destroyed all that, as I'll show. Now, these amendments were passed. They'd been sitting in Congress for about 3 years when a pharmaceutical drug tragedy happened in Europe. Thalidomide was a new sleeping drug, which was actually very safe for adults. It was much better than the barbiturates, where, a lot of people were having overdoses, accidental overdoses. So it was hailed as a great thing. And women found that when they took it, it helped their morning sickness. And when the pharmaceutical company found out about that, of course, it started promoting the drug for that. Unfortunately, even though it was safe for adults, it wasn't safe for the unborn child. And if a woman took it in her first, I think it was 6 to 12 weeks of pregnancy, she ran the risk of having babies that were missing a limb, like an arm or a leg. Otherwise normal, but missing an arm or a leg. And of course, since there's a 9-month gestation period, it took a while before people figured out, oh, it's thalidomide that's doing this. And even when they did, the manufacturer kind of was, I don't know, how could this be? Because at that point in time, there was not a wide recognition that the fetus was much more sensitive to drugs than the mother was. That was not one of our scientific understandings at that time. So that was very unfortunate. And of course, the manufacturer had not tested in pregnant animals, but even if they had, they probably wouldn't have seen anything because only primates, monkeys and people basically, and one strain of rabbits exhibit this side effect of thalidomide. So if they had done it in rats and dogs, which are generally the species one uses, they probably wouldn't have seen anything anyway. And this is part of the problem with animal studies, is they don't always predict what happens in people. And so there's no guarantees through animal studies that we'll know what's going to happen. Anyhow, these amendments, because they had actually not been designed for safety protection of the American public, they were actually designed to give the FDA much more power, and did so. And they were passed and would not have changed probably the availability of thalidomide in this country. Now, in the United States, we didn't have much in the way of thalidomide tragedies because the FDA had not yet approved it. It was worried about safety problems with the kidney, which turned out not to be so much of an issue. But the examiner who had held back on thalidomide was given an award. She did the right thing for the wrong reason and was given an award. And this sent a signal to the FDA that we'd rather be very conservative and keep a life-saving drug from the market rather than risk having a big side effect. So this really influenced the way the FDA thought about its new power that it got from the 1962 Kefauver-Harris amendments. And how did this exhibit itself? Well, prior to the passage of amendments, it took about 4.5 years from a drug to get from the lab bench, discovered by a chemist or a biologist, to the marketplace, 4.5 years. Now, these amendments basically gave the FDA the power to every year ramp up what was required, and they did that. So starting in the 60s, the number of years it took to get a drug to market increased. By the year 2000, it took 14.5 years from a drug to get to the lab bench to the market. In other words, 10 years had been added to the development time of drugs. Now, there are some people who just can't wait 14.5 years to get a drug to save their lives. And at this time, the population we were dealing with that was in that category the most were the AIDS patients. We didn't have anything for them. We were developing it for them, but it was going to be many years before it got to market. By the time the FDA gave our companies permission to put our new drugs, our new AIDS drugs in people, every AIDS patient in the country that wanted them had already taken them. How? They hadn't waited for the FDA. They had hired black market chemists to make these drugs, and they distributed them throughout the AIDS community with pretty good safety success because they had a network where they communicated what went wrong with the drugs, what went right, and the pharmaceutical companies didn't want to sue them, even though they were obviously infringing on their patents, because they didn't want to alienate the community they would be selling drugs to. And the FDA wisely did not prosecute them, even though they were violating regulatory law. And I say wisely because obviously these people need a chance to save their own lives. But had they prosecuted, it would have shown the American public how dangerous these regulations actually are, how they kill by keeping life-saving drugs out of the hands of very sick people. And if you want to read more on this, it's a very interesting read. Get Jonathan Quitney's Acceptable Risks. He's got a book about it, Acceptable Risks. Did you? That I don't know. I don't know if Magic Johnson was one of the patients. Okay, so now you might say, well, okay, so what does that mean? Does that mean if we want a new drug, we have to go to the black market? Well, actually, that's still happening today to some extent. But you know, cancer patients were another group that were in a very life-threatening situation, and they decided they didn't want to go the black market route. They wanted to sue the FDA for permission to buy drugs from the pharmaceutical companies that had had safety testing in people but hadn't yet had effectiveness testing. Effectiveness testing is a very long process in people for reasons I won't get into in this talk unless you want to ask during the Q&A. But anyhow, they just wanted to buy the drugs. They weren't interested in having them given to them. No, they just wanted to buy them, right? And they sued the FDA because they said our Constitution promises us life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and for us to have life, we need to have some drug treatment here, so we're going to sue. And the lower court ruled that, no, that wasn't going to happen. They didn't believe that Americans had that right. It was appealed to the Supreme Court that refused to hear the case in 2008. And so the lower court ruling stands. We have no right to save our lives with unapproved drugs. Now, I can assure you that this decision is going to be revisited because there are a lot of people in this country who do not want to wait. And today, in the world of the internet, people know there's something out there. Before, if the FDA held up a drug, there was no way to know. The people just didn't know there was a possibility for them. Today, they know. So that's going to be revisited. And that's what I mean. This is going to be a big, big issue on many fronts. Now, interestingly enough, there's enough data out there that we can actually calculate how many Americans lost their lives prematurely by this delay caused by the 62 amendments. And we can do this because we know how many lives that the drugs currently on the market save every year. There's been studies on that. And of course, we know the difference between the time it takes to get through the FDA process today, and in each decade, it's been measured decade by decade. And we can compare that to the 4.5 years that we know was the norm before these amendments were passed. It turns out about 4.7 million Americans died prematurely between the time the amendments were passed and the year 2000, based on the numbers that we have, 4.7 million people. Now, this might be okay if the amendments saved more lives than that, right? I mean, if the amendments were so good that they saved lives, okay, we could buy into that, but that is not the case. You know, the reason drugs, unsafe drugs, get to market, I mean, barring fraud, which does happen on occasion, but usually it's because we don't know any better. We don't have the science to know which genetic populations are going to react poorly to the drugs, or which disease entities might cause a person to be more sensitive to the problems with that drug, or things like that. Just like thalidomide, we just simply don't know better. That's usually how a bad drug gets to market. So there really isn't, these regulations don't improve our scientific knowledge. They just make the companies do more and more studies in the hope that something will turn up. And of course, I have to say, in a way, you have to be sympathetic to the FDA, because when a new drug comes on the market, it's going to have side effects. Every drug has side effects. There just isn't any way around that, right? So when an FDA examiner signs off and approves a drug, if those side effects that that drug have become public knowledge and the public has a hue and cry, that examiner is going to be called in front of Congress and ask why in the world he or she approved that drug. Well, so what incentive do they have to approve the drug? There's no downside if people die because the drug's not on the market. So you have to have a little bit of sympathy for the way these people are put between a rock and a hard place. Anyhow, getting back to this point, though, of how many people the amendments save, excuse me for a minute. We can calculate that too. And the reason we can is we know how many people died from drug side effects or had, a very serious health problem from them for the 12 years before the amendments were passed. We have very good records for that. And so based on that, we can extrapolate how many lives could be saved if we could have wiped all of that out. Now, of course, we can't. We can't wipe it all out because those drugs were put on the market because we didn't know any better. But let's assume that we could have wiped all that out and that these regulations were so good, they're going to wipe out all the ones that happen after that at the same rate. Well, that's about 7,000 lives that we would save during the time that 4.7 million people lost their lives because they didn't get access to a life-saving drug. So that's a big difference. In fact, you can imagine, you can say, well, of course there's more drugs on the market every decade because the old drugs stay on for a while, so there's more chance of drug interaction and people take more drugs today, so maybe that 7,000 number is a little low. So let's multiply it by 10. That's 70,000 versus 4.7 million. Let's multiply it by 100. 700,000 versus 4.7 million. You can kind of see that no matter how you juggle the numbers, more people died waiting than they were protected by the amendments. And you know what? I haven't told you the bad news about the amendments yet. I'm just getting started. Yeah, it gets worse. But before I go into how it gets worse, I want to also talk about costs, because remember I started this talk talking about healthcare costs. Now you might imagine if you add 10 years to the development time of a drug, you're going to increase costs, right? Yeah, just a little bit. And actually, once again, we can calculate that because we have data from before the amendments were passed. We know that costs were increasing gradually every year before the amendments. But after the amendments, it went like this. About 8 times as much it costs to get a drug on the market today than it would have if the pre-amendment trend had continued. So what that means is about 85% of what we pay at the pharmacy today are due to these regulations. 85%, that's huge, it's huge. And Congress actually confirmed that because when they passed an amendment called the Waxman-Hatch to extend the patent life of drugs. By the definition in that regulation, in that piece of law, they calculated that the portion of that 14 and a half years that was due to regulations was 84% of that time. So that fits very right on with that calculation. So you can see even by Congress's own definition, most of the time it takes to get a drug to market are due to regulations. The only disagreement libertarians have with Congress is they think that's a good thing, and it's obviously not. Okay, so this is a huge cost, and now you can kind of see that regulations can have an incredible financial cost just at the pharmacy. And I haven't even talked about the loss that comes from the loss of lives. You know, when somebody dies early in the middle of their productive years, there's a lot of wealth creation that's lost. So, you know, there's more at stake than just the cost at the pharmacy. But, you know, this, as you can see, that itself is huge. But I did tell you that I had only begun to tell you the bad news about the amendments. Yeah, so let's get started on some of the really bad news. And that is how it impacts on innovation. You know, it doesn't matter how wealthy you are. If the cure for cancer hasn't been invented yet, and you have cancer, you're in trouble. Or if you have anything else, that the cure hasn't been invented yet, you're in trouble. Your money can't even buy the cure. And that's why innovation is so important. Innovation is really the key to a long life. And I use that broadly to mean not only pharmaceutical innovation, but scientific knowledge, medical know-how, etc. Now, what happened in the pharmaceutical industry is that since they had these huge development costs now that went to satisfying the regulations, they could no longer do as much research. So they couldn't invent as many new drugs. And studies show that innovation is down by at least a factor of 2. In other words, we've lost half our innovation at least. I can tell you it's probably a lot more than that, but it's at least that, according to the studies. And breakthrough drugs, the new cures, those are the hardest to get through the FDA. Let me tell you a little story about how that goes. I actually was sitting at my desk one day at the Upjohn Company. I picked up the phone, and it was the FDA. The examiner for my section, the gastrointestinal section, was on the phone, and he said, "Dr. Ruwart, I understand you just filed a patent for prostaglandins and liver disease." I said, "Yes, that's right." And he said, "I am so excited about this. 100,000 people die from liver disease every year. We have no cure. We want you to know that here at the FDA, we're going to do everything in our power to help you get this drug to market." Well, I was young and naive, so I thought this was great news. I thought that it would actually mean something. But the sad truth is that, something like liver disease, which had never been, no one had ever really thought they had something good for it before. It's a hard disease to work with. It takes years to develop. It's hard to look at the blood and see what state your liver is in. The state of the art at that point was liver biopsy, taking a piece of the liver out, which means, surgery. It's not a trivial thing. So also we didn't know how often we had to give our drug because it was a new drug. We didn't know what dose we had to give. And we knew that since it took years to develop, it would probably take years to treat. So we were looking at studies that took many, many years. If we did not guess right on the dose, the timing of the dose, everything the first time, it's likely that when the results were analyzed, they wouldn't have the very high statistical significance that the FDA required. Now, statistical significance it just means that you have enough people and a strong enough response that you're sure within about 5% that this isn't a chance event. And that means, in a disease like this where there's a lot of variability and a lot of factors, it's going to mean a lot of patients. So we could spend a lot of money looking at a lot of patients for a lot of years and then find out we just missed the statistical significance. And if that happened, we'd have to start all over again. And if we had to start all over again, by the time we got the drug to market, the patent would have run out and it would have gone generic the first day. And then we would not have recovered our development costs. So the company made a business decision not to develop this drug because there was too much risk. Risk of basically of losing our shirt on it. And so that is how a lot of innovation does not get to market because of the FDA. Now, before the 1962 Kefauver-Harris amendments were passed, we could have marketed this drug and said, this drug is relatively safe because every drug has side effects under these conditions, and we think it might be good for liver disease because our animal results suggest that. We could have done that under the old system, but under the new system, you cannot say that. You cannot market a drug that way. You have to prove that it is effective in the way that the FDA wants. And this is very difficult because think about it for a moment. If I have a drug that cures 50% of the people, that's a pretty good, you can say that's effective. You're pretty happy with that. But what if it only cures 1 out of 10 or 2 out of 10? Is it effective? Well, it is for those 2 people, isn't it? But if you do statistics on it and try to get the statistical significance, you won't see it with 1 or 2 people. And that's where the problem comes in. It's really very difficult to tell, to define effectiveness. In fact, it's so hard that the courts actually had a case come to them when the FDA was trying to get Congress to approve a law to have them regulate effectiveness. The courts ruled that effectiveness was a matter of opinion. So, and that's why. Okay, so getting back to this loss of innovation, the problem too with losing innovation is innovative drugs are generally a lot cheaper than the alternative. For example, when the first anti-ulcer drug, Tagamet, came out, it cost a lot of money. It was about $1,000 a year. This is back in the 80s, so this is a lot of money back then. And you probably had to take it for 2 years, or 2 courses. $2,000, a lot of money for a drug back then. But you didn't have to have your stomach, you didn't have to have surgery, which is $25,000. You didn't have to lose time from work. You didn't have to lose time from your family. So, actually, it was quite a good trade-off. So you see, drugs, as opposed to hospitalization, is a good trade-off. So when we lose innovation, we don't just lose, we lose lives, obviously, and that's bad enough. We also lose money. We actually increase the cost of treating whatever the disease is. And you can make calculations about how much money and how many lives were lost. If you think that the lost drugs were just as effective as the ones we have on the market, then we've probably lost over 16 million American lives just because of the losses in innovation. So it's huge. It's much bigger even than the loss in the development delay. It's huge. And it's a huge cost also for, it's a huge percentage. It's like 25% of your healthcare costs. It's huge. It's just huge. And part of the innovation that the FDA is prohibiting today is in stem cell research. Now, I know stem cell research has been very controversial because it used to be that we got stem cells from fetus or a placenta, but that's all gone. Now you can get adult stem cells. So, for example, if you need a knee replacement, you can go to a stem cell doctor. He can take the stem cells out of your body, and if he cultures them for a week or a month or whatever time, the protocol keeps changing based on what's happening, but he cultures them, makes them very, so you have lots of stem cells now. He grows them, so you have lots of stem cells, and he injects them back into your body. It can save you from a knee replacement. That's pretty cool, huh? Yeah. The problem is it's illegal in the U.S. It was developed in the U.S. By a doctor in Denver, and the FDA said, well, if you take the cells out of people and then you put them back in the same day, that's okay. But if you take them out of people and you grow them in a petri dish or whatever, a culture flask, for any length of time, you're manipulating them, and that makes them a drug. And so you have to go through this 14 years of testing before it's legal for you to do this. Now, in a field like this, that's impossible. There's no way it could even make it through the process for a number of reasons. One, it probably isn't patentable. Two, the procedure changes all the time as the doctors learn more. They try to optimize it for the next patient, right? They try to learn as they go. So this is all offshore. So now you get to go to Bermuda or someplace offshore in Europe if you want this kind of treatment. And you can just imagine the extra cost of a knee replacement as opposed to a stem cell treatment. I won't even go there. So the bottom line is these amendments you can show have probably cost, probably added, about 25 to 55% of our current medical costs are probably due to the passage of these amendments. That is huge. And remember, I'm just talking about pharmaceutical regulation. I haven't talked about the regulation of doctors or hospitals or nurses, anything like that. Those are just as devastating. And of course, these amendments, they could be justified maybe if they actually save people's lives, but as you see, they don't. And they've also done something else, though. I haven't told you the worst news yet. If you think that's bad, okay, what I'm going to tell you now, I can't quantify, but I believe it to be bigger than everything else I've told you so far. And that is these amendments change the whole shift of medical treatment from prevention to treatment. We were on the verge of knowing how to prevent a lot of these diseases. The Kefauver-Harris amendments changed the pharmaceutical and medical culture to treatment as opposed to prevention. And let me explain how they did that. First of all, you know, when I was young and naive and started working for the Upjohn Company, one of the first things I realized is that alcohol damage to the liver could be prevented largely by B vitamins. I mean, this was out in the literature, but no one was paying attention to it much, and I said, oh, I went to my boss and said, wow, all we got to do is put B vitamins in alcohol, and we're going to prevent a lot of liver disease. He said, yeah, that would be good, but one little problem. He says the Tobacco, Firearms, and Alcohol Division has a regulation. You know, if you do that, you're adulterating the alcohol. Now, that's not the FDA, but still, it's a regulation, you know. So we're not preventing alcoholic liver disease, which, as you know, is very deadly and affects a lot of people because we're not willing to put B vitamins in our alcohol. This is just nuts. One of the beer companies actually tried to do that, and that's how this regulation came to be. Okay, so the other thing, nutrition can provide very inexpensive treatments for disease. I was on an airplane once, and I was talking to the gentleman next to me, and he said, Dr. Ruwart, he said, I understand your company is working on these Lazaroids that cure about anything. That's why we called them Lazaroids, because they cured about anything, right, as Lazarus. Okay, so he says, could you get me some? I said, well, you know, they're in development. Generally, we can't do that, but I will ask the project manager, right? So I go to the project manager, and I say, is there any hope for this gentleman to get some? He said, no. He said, but just tell him to take lots of vitamin E. It does the same thing. In fact, the Lazaroids were sort of knockoffs, chemical knockoffs of vitamin E, which is probably why they worked so well. But we can't develop vitamin E, even though the Upjohn Company was actually making a lot of vitamin E. Remember in the beginning of this talk, I told you that the drug companies were making the vitamins. Well, Upjohn was making vitamin E, right? We had a lot of it. We would have loved to sell it for all these things, but we can't because it has to go through this long process and it has no patent protection. So it goes generic the first day and we lose all our development costs. So we can't do it. It's economic suicide. But, you know, that's the kind of thing that the Kefauver-Harris amendments are creating. That's the kind of milieu they're creating where you have to use a drug instead of an inexpensive vitamin. And so as you might imagine, drug companies don't study vitamins except as a prototype for the drug they want to make. In other words, so many drugs, most people probably don't know this, but most drugs are actually knockoffs of compounds that are in your body. You know, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to copy nature, but copy in such a way we can get a patent so that we can meet the regulations, which is crazy because, of course, as a libertarian, I'm not that fond of patents, especially since I've been through the process so many times. It's really not the intellectual property that a lot of libertarians think of it as. It's a game, unfortunately. And it's very sad, and we wouldn't need them if we didn't have these regulations. When I joined the Upjohn Company in the mid-'70s, they were still developing drugs without patents because the regulations hadn't kicked in fully. So we were still able to do that. But very shortly after I arrived, they made a business decision to not develop anything without a patent because the costs were soaring and they were getting more every year. So that's why companies patent. And if we didn't have the patents, we probably wouldn't have a pharmaceutical industry, and maybe that would be a good thing because then maybe people would wake up to the problems with the FDA, or specifically with the Kefauver-Harris amendments that gave the FDA their teeth. Okay, so to really appreciate how bad this is, you have to understand how the FDA operates in this realm. So, for example, the FDA claims that the First Amendment does not protect commercial speech. So because it doesn't protect commercial speech, when we discovered in the 1980s that folic acid, a B vitamin, could prevent neural tube defects in babies, the folic acid companies were told by the FDA that they would shut them down if they talked about this. Now, to really understand how important this is, neural tube defects, just like the thalidomide effect, happen early in pregnancy. Most women don't even know that they are pregnant when this very bad thing is happening already. So the idea was that every childbearing woman in the country might want to think about taking a folic acid supplement to prevent that. Very cheap, very inexpensive, and it prevents neural tube defects, which puts babies in an institution. It's not a matter of losing a limb and otherwise being normal. I mean, these children generally are institutionalized. And even when the Center for Disease Control, another government agency, started telling young women this, the FDA still told the folic acid manufacturers that they even mentioned the Center for Disease Control's recommendation that they would be shut down because they did not go through this process. Therefore, they could not make a claim for folic acid. So I estimate about 25,000 children were probably either saddled with these defects or aborted during the time that there was such a tight lid on this. Now, if a young woman goes to her doctor, generally her doctor will recommend folic acid, but this was a long time in coming. It took about 20 years. So these amendments that were made to prevent thalidomide from coming to the U.S. actually created an American thalidomide of its own. Very sad. Now, the FDA in recent years has sent out letters to manufacturers of cherries, walnuts, and other foods that put anything on their website like, studies have shown that these compounds in cherries and walnuts might help prevent cancer or might help in inflammation, and the FDA has written them letters. They're on the FDA website. You can go and look them up. And it basically says, you're saying things on your website that make cherries or walnuts a drug, therefore you have to go through this process if you want to make these claims. Fish oil got a very bad rap for a long time from the FDA. Finally, one manufacturer said, okay, I'm going to bite the bullet and I'm going to go through this horrible process and I'm going to have prescription fish oil because this stuff is dynamite. So they did. And now they are the only fish oil manufacturer that is allowed by law to go to doctors' offices and say to the doctor, our fish oil will help with cardiovascular disease. And so, of course, the doctors will only prescribe this fish oil to their patients. They won't tell them to go to Walmart and get the same product. They'll get this prescription fish oil. And the copay for the prescription fish oil, the copay is as much as if you went to Walmart and got the same thing. So this is another way that it increased costs. Even if you jump through those hoops as a natural product, the costs are so much greater that it really just makes everything difficult. Now there have been, important part for libertarians to understand is that a lot of the things I've talked about today are maybe not known in great detail to the American public, but there's a segment of the American public that is very much aware that the FDA is not necessarily their friend, and that are the vitamin takers. A lot of the vitamin manufacturers actually are libertarians. So the Life Extension Foundation, for example, was founded by libertarians. The FDA has tried to shut them down a number of times and failed miserably. I'm so glad. They are one of my favorite sources to point people to if you want to learn more about what nutrition can do for you, lef.org. That's Life Extension Foundation. So lef.org, really great place to learn more. And I want to point out to you that every time the FDA has tried to regulate vitamins, which are two major times in the past, I think it's 15 years, Congress has gotten more mail on this issue than any other issue. Okay, vitamin takers are activists. They get the libertarian perspective when it comes to nutrition in the FDA. This means that if you can recruit them or talk to them, they're going to understand the libertarian perspective in this area, and they're more likely to understand the libertarian perspective in other areas too. I think we have made a big error in not trying to recruit these people. They are activists. There are a lot of them, and they're on our side. And on this issue, we are really the only group that supports their position. I'd like to end with a little bit of a quote here by Dale Greninger, who wrote this in the Wall Street Journal. I think you'll enjoy this. He says, economic studies have been virtually unanimous. FDA regulation certainly cannot be proved, quote, safe and effective, end quote, thereby flunking its own approval criterion.
If you have any questions, please come line up here. It's a prerogative for first question. Dr. Ruwart, you mentioned patents and regulation, how they relate to each other. I know Stefan Kinsella has really been pushing the idea amongst libertarians that patents are unconstitutional in a sense. But explain how, in a pure free market, people who still have spent a lot of time developing drugs so they don't get sued in the free market for harming people. How do you protect what you've done in the marketplace without a patent type of situation?
Yourself without a patent the same way the pharmaceutical companies did before patents became a big issue. And that is you get to the marketplace first. And the way it used to be is that the companies would develop something, and since they had a fairly narrow window of, even under FDA regulation as it existed before '62, it was usually less than 5 years. And it was possible to keep quiet during that time to some extent, to do your studies quietly, and to get to the marketplace first. Usually scientists talk and, we kind of know what's going on, but first to the market was the big winner. And that is something the FDA is sort of corrupted, because the FDA, by demanding more studies from one company instead of another, can actually decide who's first to market. And even today, that's a biggie. So that's one thing. The other thing, there's been studies that show that the only innovation that's really helped is in the chemical and pharmaceutical industry by patents. And those are the two most heavily regulated industries at the time the study was done. So I think it's pretty clear. I said patents were a game. That's another thing. They don't really protect you. There's always a way around. And I could go into that in great detail, but it's beyond the scope of this talk. So I'm not sure that patents are really what most libertarians think they are.
All right, Codex Alimentarius, I hear about it happening in Europe. The idea that many beer scares me, whatever.
Yes.
Should I be scared?
Yes, well, okay, so just to explain to people who don't know what Codex Alimentarius is, this is an international organization which has made it its business to bring what they call harmonization to the pharmaceutical marketplace. By this they mean that they hold everything up to the highest standard. So in other words, they want all vitamins to have to go through this process. And in Germany, they've prevailed because the German government has accepted it. So if you want more than 200 milligrams of vitamin C, you have to do it by prescription in Germany. To give you an example, I take 10 times that much on a daily basis, and there are many people who take much more. So it's really, really bad. Now, there is a gentleman who has figured out a workaround, which I think is really good. This code is enforced by the World Trade Organization, which presumes that this code is in place unless your country has actually passed different standards. So he's encouraging countries to pass different standards. I don't know how successful he's been, but I do know that the European Union rejected Alimentarius a couple years back when it was up for a vote, so there's hope.
Are you familiar with the Surgery Center of Oklahoma?
No, I'm not.
Okay, my daughter was 26 years old 2 years ago, and she was diagnosed with thyroid cancer. She had medical insurance that was non-renewable, and her medical insurance expired 10 days after she was diagnosed. So we were on our own. She lives out in California. She went to Reno, Nevada, and was quoted about $25,000 for a cash price for surgery. Right at that time, Lou Rockwell on LouRockwell.com had an interview with Keith Smith, who was the head of Surgery Center of Oklahoma. He posts the price of his surgical procedures on his website. A thyroidectomy is $6,200 cash. So my daughter flew from California to Oklahoma City. My wife flew from here, flew out and had the surgery, came out fine. He's a libertarian. He has a wonderful website. He's on Facebook. He writes articles day in and day out on the medical cartel who criticize it very broadly. So I want to let everyone know of that.
Yeah.
Surgery Center of Oklahoma. If you have no medical insurance, look them up.
Okay. And what's the website? Do you remember?
SurgeryCenterOK.com.
Okay, surgerycenterok.com.
Yeah.
Okay, I think that is great. And along these lines, there's going to be, the doctors who are opting out of Medicare and a lot of the other, they won't let insurance bill them and stuff. They are able to give treatment at lower prices, and this is starting to be big. Also, medical tourism. People are going out of the country. It's actually cheaper sometimes to fly first class to India and get your surgery done over there. So this is going to be big business in the next few years.
Dr. Ruwart, thank you for your comments. I feel a lot better about the 27 pill bottles sitting on my counter upstairs in my room. I take Leviza, which I'm sure was the drug you were talking about, and I have been considering dumping it for just krill oil. Would you comment on that?
Well, if I were trying to make that decision, what I would do is I would go to the Life Extension Foundation's website, lef.org, because they actually talk about krill oil, they talk about the different prescription fish oils, they talk about, they actually have their own fish oil too, which they enhance with some other cofactors, I guess I should say, that help it work. So I would check them out. I find them to be pretty balanced, as balanced as you can be when you're actually selling some products. Let's face it, there's an emphasis on what they sell, but what they do is they find something new that's exciting and then they bring it to the marketplace. That's one of the things that they do.
I worked as an engineer and, sorry?
Closer? Okay.
Yeah, an engineer worked a lot in medical devices.
Can't hear you. Yeah, a little closer.
Yeah, actually, you got to point it like this. Yeah, you got to put it right up. Because even if I go like this, I can't hear you. You can just listen.
Okay. Anyway, I am an engineer, and in the course of my career, I've worked a lot on medical devices, and so I've been exposed to the FDA compliance issues often. And I have the impression that the U.S. FDA is by far the most onerous of any regulatory body of that type in the world. Is that your impression?
For devices, yes. Devices are even worse. The story I told about pharmaceuticals, multiply it by about 3 or 4 for devices, medical devices. And the European Union has a much better system. They have a private group that works with the device manufacturers and makes sure that they dot all their I's and cross their T's and actually hold their hand through the regulatory process. And then the regulatory authorities basically take their word for it that that's happened, and they pass them much quicker. It's much easier to get a medical device approved in Europe because of that.
Yeah, and the Roche product that I just worked on, the diabetes thing, they're actually marketing initially in Europe rather than the U.S. for that.
That's right.
Basically,
That's right.
that's my impression.
That's right. Yes. There's a lot of drugs we don't have here because the FDA is prejudiced against them, and medical devices, of course, that's, like I said, that's sort of par for the course.
I would like to offer an additional answer to Ken's initial question about protecting yourself in a basically non-patent-oriented world. My initial answer to Ken's question is, come up with something better. To illustrate my point, I would like to offer the name of Ferdinand Porsche. He's the guy who's been credited with designing the Volkswagen Beetle. When he complained to his wife over dinner one night that somebody else was, stealing one of his ideas, his wife said, well, maybe you should sue. Ferdinand Porsche said, don't bother, I've already got something better in mind. Thank you for your time.
Yes, very good solution.
I wanted to ask you to please say more about the difference between technology as a solution to improving health and traditional food and like Hippocrates said, let food be your medicine and medicine be your food. And there's a lot of traditional approaches that can be used to heal. And maybe you could say more about when traditional is better or when technology is better. But I think the FDA is suppressing the traditional and the whole system. You got into that a little at the end. I mean, one example is never had a drop of breast milk because when I was born, people believed in technology. And you have to feed your babies this high-tech stuff. Now they're telling us that sunlight is bad. Well, sunlight produces vitamin D, and vitamin D-C prevents cancer. Or vitamin D, so talk about
Vitamin D3, yeah. Yeah, well, okay, I'll just tell this little story. You know, when I first came to the Upjohn Company, of course, this is before all the genetic manipulation of animals and stuff. So if we wanted, you know, we had taken these rats and fed them well and titrated all their nutrition so that they'd be healthy. So we'd be working with, you know, healthy rats, right? So then we want to study disease, we have to make them sick. It was really hard to make them sick. The only way we really could do it was to take away their vitamins. Now, this tells you something. So I think maybe that kind of answers the question about food. You know, food and nutrition is extremely important. Your body is a wonderful machine. If you give it the right material, it can do some incredible things. And so I guess I would say, what's the balance? It's up to you. I mean, every individual, unfortunately, has to make this decision on their own because we are not I don't believe we're in a position to be able to tell what you need when necessarily in nutrition. So still a lot of guesswork involved. You just have to see how you feel and what your body tells you, and it will tell you.
Dr. Ruwart, your presentation has been very informative and helpful, but I noticed that you didn't talk at all about vaccines, and I was hoping that you could perhaps give us a few comments, particularly in light of a video that I saw on the HPV vaccine. I think it's HPV, one that they're pushing for young girls and now young boys in high school. I saw a video on it that was extremely disturbing. I'm wondering if you've seen any videos about significantly harmful side effects for rare occasions of people taking these vaccines.
But you could have a whole talk on vaccines. Let me see if I can be very brief here. Vaccines have a lot of good potential in that they can prevent diseases that we've never been able to prevent before. In fact, that's how they got started. You know, we wiped out a lot of traditional diseases with that, you know, that typhoid and things like that, polio, with vaccines. Very good thing that way. Unfortunately, some of the things that are put in the vaccines and the way they're given to infants in multiple doses, so you're giving so many vaccines at once, can create problems. You know, infants don't handle things the way adults do. So they may not have the biochemical equipment to take care of some of the things we put in vaccines. So there's some issues there. There's some concerns that we're actually making our children sick. Certainly, it's a difficult decision for any parent to make today. And there's a lot of information out there suggesting that that can be dangerous. On the FDA part of it, the FDA has regulated vaccines in a way, again, if you go to lef.org and put in vaccine, you can see a very recent article about how the FDA ran the good vaccine manufacturers out of business, and now the people who are making vaccines are not so careful with their product. So there's a lot of issues with vaccines. I know that's probably not enough information, but it would probably take another 10 minutes to get too much more detailed.
How about just a general comment? Is it the opposite of drugs that they let those sort of much quicker and easier?
No, actually, sometimes they don't. They do the opposite. When we sent our troops to the Gulf War, you know, they needed some vaccines to protect themselves from diseases over there. But there weren't enough to go around because the FDA had not yet approved the additional site that the manufacturer had put up to make these vaccines. So our women went over there without them.
I just want to ask, because I recently saw a documentary called Brzezinski,
Yes.
which talks about a doctor in Dallas who had discovered a possible medication for cancer called antineoplastin.
Yes.
And one of the big things in the documentary was that the current treatment now of chemotherapy and radiation were developed in the 80s and the 70s. So his is very new, but there was a lot of fighting. He was attacked on all sides from the FDA.
That's right.
And they wanted to pull his license. Could you give your opinion on Dr. Brzezinski and his cure, or possible cure for cancer?
He's been around for a long time. Actually, about 30 years ago, I met some libertarians in Michigan who were taking his products, and they swore by them. So, you know, I think there's probably something to them. The FDA came after him even after he, I mean, they brought him to trial, I can't remember how many times. The juries wouldn't convict, and the FDA still hounded him even after he agreed to work through the system. So now he cannot give his anti-neoplasms to anybody who comes. He has to put them in one of the clinical trials that the FDA has approved. And in these trials, you have to have failed other, at least about 4 years ago, you had to have failed other chemo and radiation treatments before they allowed you in these trials, which is just ridiculous. So I think he's got something, but I don't, you know, I haven't, how can I say it? I'm not in a position to evaluate his work, but you know, he's just had so much patient support that you have to think something is going on there. Even if it's an enhanced placebo effect, I don't think cancer patients care how they're cured.
Okay, well, this is more in the realm of information for everybody rather than a question for you. My husband, Jeff Jones, and I own a health food store, which we have owned for almost 30 years now. Actually, over 30 years now. And we wanted to let everybody know that the FDA is after us again, and now they're doing something called the New Dietary Ingredients Act. They want to take everything new off the shelf for the last 20 years, and they want to put the onus of burden of proof on the health food industry, but they won't tell us what their guidelines are. Many people in the health food industry have said, okay, well, we'll prove the efficacy of niacinamide. Tell us what the guidelines are. What do we need to do to prove the whole thing to you? And they say, you do the tests, and we'll decide whether that was okay or not after they're over. Please call your senators. Everybody takes vitamins. If you want to keep taking acai berries and other new things like krill oil, which have come down the pike, please write your senator. Tell all your friends to write them. Tell them to keep their hands off your vitamins. Thank you very much.
I'm glad to hear that story, and I'd like to hear more, so please connect with me afterwards. Thank you.
Dr. Mary, thank you very much